to Freedom and also the African Survivor Coalition. It truly is an honor and thank you very, very much. Now, I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes and we're going to really take a deep dive into what is trauma just in general and then get more specific later on. So if I could ask Lucia if you could put um, the PowerPoint up. Perfect. Yeah. And so basically, psychological trauma is defined as mental health injury caused by a distressing event or a series of events that overwhelm a person's ability to cope. Now, those are just really big words, but let's look at the different kinds of trauma. Now, acute means, let's say, for example, there's a car accident or somebody attacked you or said they were going to attack you. It's kind of like a one-time thing. That's acute. And, whether or not you get some kind of trauma reaction afterwards, we will see, but it's narrowed down into this one thing. Now, chronic is more you're in a situation of danger, but it happens again and again. So this could be maybe you're in a violent relationship, or of course, this also applies to trafficking and or sexual slavery. So this can have long-term impact on your emotional health, on your physical health, and also on your behavior. Now, it doesn't have to. This is the important thing about trauma. Everybody is different, everybody's reactions are different, and it's possible to go backwards. It's possible to treat, but first, it's really important to understand what's happening with you. Now, complex trauma is the same thing, like chronic, it goes and it goes and it goes, it keeps coming, but there's often a very special and very hard component to that. And that is that it often starts in childhood, and the people who were supposed to have been protecting you didn't. Maybe this could be in the case of trafficking that you were sold by a parent, or it could be that a guardian or somebody was the person who was attacking you, whatever. Complex trauma is followed by even more, it can be followed by even more complicated symptoms later on. Because, like, if you're in a situation like that, that the person that you trust is somehow doing bad things, you just somehow have to survive as a kid, you know what I mean? Or as a vulnerable person. And what happens often in that case is something called dissociation. And that is that you just kind of leave the room in your head. You know what I mean? Your head just blocks off someplace else. And then your body is still there, but you kind of separate who you are away. And that is for self-protection. And see, the thing about all of these is that it doesn't just turn off when you get out of the situation of danger. It can come back, and that's why it's important to look at. Now, I wrote down other events here, and that just means, well, maybe you're in a situation of war in your country. Maybe everybody around you is nice, but you're in war. Maybe there is a natural disaster like a flood. Maybe there's a terrorist attack or something. And so in those situations, we don't know if it's going to be acute or complex or whatever. But just keep in mind, these are the four basic models. And now what we're going to do next is to look at the reactions. But first, I want you to think about, let's say that there's a person who might attack you, okay? Well, something in your body called the sympathetic nervous system kicks in and it gets you ready to do something. That's just a physical reaction that all of us have. And so it means your heart is going to start beating faster, your blood pressure is going to go up, you're going to breathe faster. It's preparing you to do something. And then what happens next depends on whether or not your instinct thinks, I can fight it, no, I can't fight it, or I can do this instead, or whatever. And so we will look at those reactions now. So, Lucia, could I ask you for the next slide? Thank you. So, and I think the word normal here is really important. These are normal human reactions. So let's say you're in this heightened stage where your body's ready to do something, and your instincts say, yep, I can fight, I can do it. Well, then what's going to happen is even this big, strong emotion will come up. Maybe it will feel like anger because you're getting ready to go to the danger, right? Maybe your fists are clenching, maybe your jaw is strong. Now, let's imagine that during that situation, when you're really in danger, there's some kind of song playing in the background in the room. Okay. Well, what could happen is that years and years later, even when you're totally not in danger anymore, that song comes on the radio. And then all of this emotion comes up again. That's called being triggered. And so this, excuse me, this can be that somebody who seems to be kind of together and you're in a normal situation, all of a sudden becomes really aggressive. Or maybe they seem really tense and you don't know why. Or maybe it's you and you're like, what's going on with me? Am I crazy? And it's like, no, you're not crazy. This is a normal reaction to trauma. And that would be the fight one. But let's say that you're in the situation of danger and you're kind of like this, but your instincts say, no, no, I can't fight. There's no way. This will not work. But maybe I can run away. That's called flight. And so then all of your instincts you kind of get nervous and tense and you're fidgety because you think there's something that I could do to run away or to escape this. That's flight. Now, again, imagine this whole song thing. Let's say that years later, you're in a room, that song comes on, and all of a sudden you're in this tense feeling. You don't know why. And it's like, I have to do something. I have to somehow get out of here. That's when, for example, sometimes people become uh, too like addicted to alcohol or to drugs or to do not feel comfortable having any kind of close relationship because that's what was learned during the situation of trauma before. Now, let's say the third one, you're in this situation, you can't fight, you also cannot run away. And so, what the body tends to do at that point is just freeze. It can feel like playing dead. Maybe you've heard that, where it's like you sometimes people just feel numb. It's like, I would like to move, but I just can't. I am just numb. And maybe your friends will say, oh man, you're spaced out. What's wrong? Where are you? And sometimes, mainly, many times with survivors in situations such as that, I have heard people saying, "Oh, I feel so ashamed. I should have done something." But no, it's not a situation to be ashamed about because freezing at some point protected you. The challenge now is to just be sure that your body relearns that the situation you're in now maybe does not require that. Now, let's look at the next one. Fawn. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that word. To fawn over somebody means to just spoil them and do everything possible for them. This is in a situation if you, for example, lived with an abuser and the abuser said, if there was the tiniest thing dirty in the house, right, then the abuser would get really violent. And so then you would take all this time to clean and clean and clean the house just not to trigger the abuser. So it's like doing way too much for somebody out of fear. But years later, what that could mean is entering relationships and not being able to say no, thinking that your power is in always, taking care of everyone around you, which is not sustainable. And so that also is something, just anything to avoid conflict can end up hurting you. Now, fine is something that all of us do at some point, but it doesn't help. That means if you've been in a situation of trauma and if you're feeling really bad, just to say, "Oh no, I'm fine. Everything's fine. Don't worry," you know. And you're denying it to other people, but to a certain extent, you might also be denying this to yourself. And so taking care of yourself is going to be important there. Now, to faint means literally to faint, like to fall down. And that's connected actually to freeze and also yeah, because when you freeze, your heart starts going lower, right? And your blood pressure goes lower, your breathing goes lower. And it can trigger you literally that it goes so low so quickly that you pass out, And so your friends, so sometimes, for example, if that song came on, you might say, "My God, I don't know why I feel so dizzy and lightheaded, right now." But there's a reason for it. And so what I wanted to do in terms of going through this is to show that the body and the mind and everything in between, this is all connected. And if you find that you have any reactions, like suddenly get angry or suddenly do this or that, it could very well be connected to past trauma. Oh, I think we have somebody's microphone on, so if we could possibly turn that off. And so keep in mind that even when you're safe, some of this stuff comes back. But again, it's possible to deal with it. And I can say that I am a psychotherapist and I've been working with trauma for many years. I can say that one of the individuals on our call, Kendall Alimo, is better at understanding the neurobiological connection, the body connection between this and trauma, between yeah, that and trauma. So anyway, looking forward to hearing your takes on this, Kendall. But anyway, so just this is just the basic overview. And now we will get into more detail. So Lucia, can we have the next page, please? Thank you. Okay, so now let's connect this directly to trafficking. And trafficking not only in Africa, trafficking anywhere. If you had past traumatic experiences, well, it might make you more vulnerable to trafficking. But this is something I've heard Malika talk about many times. If let's say that you have complex trauma because in your childhood you were abused. Okay. Well, traffickers can see that and they can see how to manipulate that. And if you were trained to fawn, to take care of anybody who is somehow being abusive to you, well, this also will possibly make you more vulnerable to trafficking. Now, it doesn't mean that it has to, that cause and effect, but it can be a part of it. But the cool thing about, I think we also, if everybody could turn off their mics, that'd be great. The cool thing about going through these things is to understand it's not cause and effect. You can change this stuff. You can stop the pattern, but it's good to see it in advance. Now, another factor is an unstable life. Now, if you have insecure housing, I don't know where I'm going to sleep tomorrow, whatever. Well, that makes you more vulnerable to somebody promising, "Oh, hey, I have a nice place for you to stay, just come here." If you're living in a time of war, if, climate change right now is a really big deal. Okay, the crops aren't growing, the goat just died. What do I do? If your life situation is unstable, even if you didn't have a traumatic childhood, that will make you more vulnerable to trafficking. And of course, unmet needs. Again, if you have no money, if you have no food, you will be more vulnerable. But maybe in your childhood, you did not have a healthy relationship. with your parents or, whatever. So if you have this need somehow to be loved that was not fulfilled or loved in a way that's healthy, then that also could make you more vulnerable to trafficking. And the thing is, again, traffickers see that. They can see that from a mile away, and then there are different manipulations that would be used to try to get this person to go with the trafficker. So now let's look at the next slide and then look at some of the connection between trafficking and trauma. Okay, so the first one, of course, violence and exploitation. If during your trafficking experience you are subjected to violence, be it sexual violence or be it, whatever, physical, whatever, then of course that's going to go back to the original causes of trauma. And if you're in a situation that you can't escape, okay, then you'll go to the freeze or whatever like that. Now, coercion and control, this would be maybe what the traffickers say is, look, I'm going to kill your family if you don't do what I say. And so in that case, then of course that's going to throw you back into another form of trauma that comes up. And then we have the social and the economic vulnerabilities. The social one is really important. Economic vulnerability, okay, no money. But social, many societies very unfortunately say, oh, well, that group of people in the society, they aren't worth as much as this group of people in the society. And so if you have grown up believing that that is actually true, then it kind of is like, well, I don't really have as many options. And maybe in your society you don't have as many options. But if you internalize that and really believe that, then that also can contribute to being vulnerable to trafficking. Now, of course, the cultural context is important, and I know that there's going to be really cool discussions on that later, so I won't go into a lot of detail about that. But it's really important, like what we're talking about now, mental health and trauma and things like that. Of course, in so many societies, you're just not allowed to talk about that because maybe it's like that's what devils talk about, or this is, it's just not okay for us to talk about it. So it also is really important to to see how somebody's culture might be used against them to keep them in a situation of trafficking. And that's yet another reason that it's so important that people with lived experience in trafficking, and for example, in this case with the focus on Africa, people with lived experience in that country somehow, that is who will be able to understand the cultural side of things, which is just critical. And this is one of the big problems in the diaspora community, because sometimes a trafficking survivor will go to try to get mental health support, let's say here in Austria where I am, and the person has absolutely no idea the cultural background. That can be re-traumatizing. And so the cultural context is just critical. Okay, so let's look at the next one. Now we're going to get into some really, really interesting stuff. Now, the word potential is just really important here. It doesn't mean that everybody who goes through this is going to have these symptoms, but I'd like to walk you through them, because if you have experienced any of this, or maybe your loved one or whatever, it's really important to understand, again, this is a normal reaction to having experienced trauma, and that means you can also do something about it. It's not going to stay with you forever. Now, PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder, as it says, and complex PTSD there. We're going to look at those two first. This just means afterwards, the symptoms don't go away after a week or after a month. It just continues. And let's look at some of the symptoms because for PTSD and complex PTSD, some of the symptoms can be the same. Um, One is, for example, you keep re-experiencing the trauma. Maybe that means that you have flashbacks. You're just doing whatever, and then all of a sudden, all of these feelings or these sights come back. Maybe you have nightmares and it's hard to go to sleep. Another thing is that you avoid people or places that might remind you of the trauma. So let's just go back to our thing with the song that was playing during the trauma. That would mean, for example, that the person would never, ever go to a situation where that song could play. And so it really limits your life choices. I know that the song thing isn't the best analogy, but this avoidance behavior really limits your range of possibilities in life. Now, another thing that both PTSD and complex PTSD have is rapid changes in your mood and thinking. One minute I'm okay, the next minute I'm completely sad, the next minute I'm over here. And again, that's normal. And the final thing that they share is feeling like you're on edge. Now, remember, we talked about when you get into a situation of trauma, your body takes over, heart rate, blood pressure, everything. And so it can feel like that a lot for people with PTSD or complex PTSD. Let's now focus on complex PTSD because, again, we had looked at complex trauma above, and that often comes when there has been some kind of repeated traumatic abuse during childhood. Now, again, it doesn't always come, and it can come from other things, like maybe you were in war and there was a repeated thing. But complex PTSD has more and arguably even more dangerous or more threatening symptoms. One is that it can be very difficult to control your emotions. Sometimes, we've all heard of somebody who committed an act of violence and said, it felt like a dream. I didn't feel like I was there. That's can be one part of complex PTSD, difficult to control your emotions. It can also be a really negative self-view. I'm worthless. I'm guilty of everything. And a lot of times it can feel like I'm totally different from everybody else, you know, when in fact it's just a reaction to trauma. Difficulties with relationships, really strong difficulties can also be a part here because the person never really had a positive relationship often. There can be a sense of just complete hopelessness. There also can be complete detachment from the trauma. Like if you meet somebody and they say, I don't remember the first 10 years of my life. Well, that might be a sign that there were significant trauma during that time. And another distinction with complex PTSD is very, very low self-esteem. Now, for trauma and trafficking survivors in general, okay, there can be depression and anxiety. In general population, it can be that way, but that is one of the trauma results that has been noticed. Now, there's something called trauma bonding that's really important to look at, and if you know it already, then pardon me in advance, but it's important to explain if you didn't know it. Um, Look, if you're in a situation of pain and fear and you're exhausted and you lost your loved ones and you're desperate, naturally you're going to reach out to somebody to help you. Of course, that's normal. But what if the only person who is in your area is your abuser? You know, it can be that somehow there is this bond then develops that you reach out to the abuser to somehow protect you. And traffickers will use this. They'll say, look, it's only me. They will try to cut you off from everybody else, and they will try to create this trauma bond. And so it's very important to, if you feel like, oh, I'm developing feelings or trying to protect my abuser, that's a trauma bond. And it's something that when you look at it, it can stop. Suicidal ideation, it just means that it just gets too much and then, thinking of possibly trying to kill yourself. Now, some of these things apply to many other things apart from trauma and trafficking, but they are the five that are very connected to trauma and trafficking. And so now in closing, we will wrap this up so that we can hear our other speakers. So Lucia, if we could look at the next one, please. Thank you very much. So again, to focus specifically on Africa, but we will be doing that. I will be delighted to hear the other speakers who will be talking about that. To keep in mind, cultural factors are critical. Vulnerability factors, this could be financial, this could be climate change, whatever. If there were other traumatic experiences, living during a time of war or parents. Now, changing family and social structures, that is critical. Because if the norms are changing that say, well, the family needs cash, the only options that we have are somehow to have this child go to another place, well, then that is a change in the family structure. Organized crime is really, really important to look at because what is legal and what is not legal changes in every society. You know what I mean? If the police are somehow involved in the exploitation, well, then, who are you going to trust? And so, how organized crime is structured in each different country really matters. Digital exploitation, we have seen all of this online. It's really important to be aware of how you could be exploited, and I believe that somebody else will be talking about that. And this is what Julian had talked about. If there is not access to services, what are you going to do? However, there are excellent peer-to-peer models, especially for trauma, to be trauma informed and to help each other. And they've been tried and true and started in Africa. And so this is something that is really exciting that maybe you guys can take the lead on. Okay, and then the final slide, Lucia, before I head out, is yeah, the most important thing is that lived experience leads. People with lived experience have to be um, not only involved, but in the lead of designing um, new methods for that culture. It's important to recognize the impact of trauma, but to know that that doesn't define who you are. You can do things to free yourself. In the process, prioritize safety and trust and go for evidence-based therapies. There's a lot of kind of weird stuff out there, especially apps can be maybe not the best to look for mental health support. But yeah, that's it. So once again, I can say it's been a complete honor to be here, and I thank you so much for the opportunity. And I really look forward to hearing the other speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Heather. This means a lot to us. Thank you for shedding light. And in fact, this brought a lot of insights. One thing that you talked about, addressing the lack of resources available. I think, okay, the lack of resources available is the fact that there is peer-to-peer modules that are available and are being adopted in some parts of Africa. I would just have one question, which is if you have any resources that can point most of us who do not know these peer-to-peer modules, you could please share with us later so that we can share with all the participants of this training. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for staying through. The next training we are going into would be Introduction to Afrocentric Trauma Informed Care by Joy Sunday Kingsley, the movement building specialist and organizational strategies for footprint to freedom. I believe that she's going to bring a lot of insight into what is really needed for Afrocentric trauma resilience Afrocentric trauma resilience in our region, we know what we are looking at, how we want to be taken care of, how we want to see survivors taken care of, and we hope that everyone stays true to also learn from Joy. Joy, please, over to you. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Chilean, and thank you so much, Edda, for that beautiful training. Now that we have learned about trauma, now let's look deeply into how this plays out in the African context. And so I'm going to be speaking on introduction to Afrocentric trauma-informed care. Now, over time, while working in this field of anti-human trafficking, I've seen, just as Edda mentioned, I've seen how many survivors, especially from Africa, had no access to therapy. But somehow they found resilience through other methods, through their spiritual work with God, or through cultural practices, through their faith, community, or even their traditional practices. And in many African regions, till today, mental health resources still remain very scarce, and therapy is often unaffordable. But over time, people have developed alternative methods for coping and overcoming trauma. We've also realized that Western approaches to trauma often mainly focus on individual therapy sections and overlooking the communal, spiritual, and cultural ways that we as Africans experience healing. Because for us, healing most times is not just about the individual, it is communal, it is spiritual, and also has to respect our cultural values. And for some, it's good. That healing can be found in a community circle, or even in a song, or even in storytelling, or even through prayer, or even in the embrace of community. And this is where Afrocentric trauma-informed care or healing comes into play. But what exactly is Afrocentric trauma-informed care? Next slide, please. Afrocentric trauma-informed care is an approach that centers African values, culture, and healing traditions. It reminds us that true healing for African survivors must be holistic, must be culturally relevant, and also spiritually meaningful. An Afrocentric trauma-informed care approach incorporates the cultural values, beliefs, and practices of African and African descent communities, providing culturally responsive care that acknowledges the historical and also the contemporary traumas experienced by African communities. Now, let's look at the key principles or concepts when we talk about Afrocentric trauma-informed care. Now, in Afrocentric trauma-informed care, one of the key concepts is community-centric healing. And what do we mean by this? In Africa, healing is almost never just about one person. It is like the community also helps you carry the weight together. The elders, family, maybe church leaders, they all play an active role. For example, when someone loses a loved one in an African home, you would see how neighbors would sometimes bring food. Some people would want to walk alongside them, sit with them, cry with them, and all of those things. That presence in itself is part of healing. Afrocentric care reminds us that healing comes from the village, it comes from the community. And as an African proverb will say, one hand cannot wash itself, right? It requires both hands. And so this is one concept of Afrocentric trauma-informed care, community-centric healing. Another is spirituality and ancestral knowledge. And this key principle majorly speaks about ancestral wisdom. Across Africa, healing often, most times, also involves prayer, especially for maybe the Christians, Muslims, and sometimes it also involves rituals, or for some people, connection with their ancestors or traditionalists. And for some, this could mean them maybe returning to church. For others, it could mean doing some rituals or storytelling or even listening to music. I mean, there are different contexts to this. Afrocentric trauma-informed care honors all of these practices as real sources of strength and resilience. And so we can't just dismiss them when we are talking about Afrocentric trauma-informed care. Another major concept in Afrocentric trauma-informed care is holistic health. Holistic health. In Africa, we don't separate the body, the mind, and the spirit. We believe they are all connected. They all make up the human. They all make up a person, right? So trauma affects all three, and so healing must also touch all three aspects of a person. A survivor may feel peace not only through talking, they may feel peace maybe through dancing, through listening to music, or even through farming, maybe going back to their villages and just farming. Like movement, creativity, and spirituality are all part of restoring balance to the human mind. And and so in the same way, healing for many African survivors is incomplete if we leave out any parts of the person. And this is why Afrocentric trauma-informed care considers every dimension of well-being, from physical to spiritual to emotional and to mental. So rather than focusing only on the psychological symptoms, it provides a more complete path to healing. Another major concept when talking about Afrocentric trauma-informed care is cultural heritage and identity. And this involves reconnecting to your culture or your heritage, because sometimes trauma can bring a sort of disconnection and shame, but culture sometimes helps restore that dignity and help you find your place, helps you find that belonging once again. For some, this might involve them reconnecting with their culture, maybe traveling back to their village to connect with people, or it could even be them speaking their languages to people that would understand, or wearing traditional clothes and participating in some traditional activities. And all of these acts are also acts of healing, and it simply reminds us who we are as Africans. Another major concept in Afrocentric trauma-informed care is the historical context. We can't talk about Afrocentric trauma-informed care without looking at the history of Africans. Trauma in Africa did not begin today like we know. It is linked to slavery, colonization, racism, and ongoing inequalities. And so these wounds have been carried across generations. So when we walk alongside a survival, especially one that is from Africa or from African descent, we need to understand that most times they don't only carry the personal pain from their trafficking experience. There's also a lot of trauma. On top of that, there's a lot also some historical pain going on. And so our role is not only to help them cope, but to also remind them that, oh, you're a part of people who have always overcame. And this could also help strengthen their spirits while also helping them understand, while also helping us understand how best to work alongside them. Next slide, please. Before we can talk deeply about healing, we also need to understand the history of trauma in African communities. I know Etta already briefly touched on it, but I'm going to briefly expand on it a bit. So according to the World Health Organization, over 116 million people in Africa were already living with mental health conditions, even before the COVID-19 pandemic. And even since then, this number has only grown because of the crisis our continent continues to face. And most of this trauma in Africa, there are so many reasons, there are so many causes, like conflict, war, displacement, poverty, the history of discrimination, gender-based violence, and even health crises like HIV and AIDS, Ebola, COVID-19, and all of those sorts. The impact of this trauma runs deep. It shows us that standard one-size-fits-all approaches are usually not enough when working with African survivors. What Africa truly needs are culturally sensitive, trauma-informed responses that see people not just as patients, but also as part of families, communities, and culture. An example of this could be instead of a survivor only visiting clinics or a therapist. We could also, if they are a Christian, we could introduce them to maybe a women's community group in a church. Or if they're a Muslim, we could have them join a Muslim group or a youth group or circle where they can cook together, pray together, sing together, and also check in on the survivor every week. That kind of care that kind of comes naturally and feels safe. And we can't talk about trauma in Africa without looking at the historical and intergenerational trauma. Please, Lucia, next slide. Historical trauma basically refers to the emotional wounding caused by colonization, slavery. Trauma, on the other hand, is how these wounds have been passed down from one generation to the next. And this intergenerational trauma shows up in four major ways. One is behavioral modeling. For example, young men or boys in Africa are being told, this term is usually used for them, oh, be a man, don't cry. Like, so many men learn to suppress their emotions. They bottle up their pain, and oftentimes this pain only resurfaces as anger, violence or silence. And this is one way to understand behavioral modeling. Another is attachment challenges. Sometimes families who have lived through trauma may struggle with trust and closeness, or a parent who grew up in instability may find it hard to form some secure bonds with their children. And so you see that trauma from the parent is now being passed down to the child, and it will definitely affect them over time. Another way this shows up is narratives and cultural transfer. Sometimes trauma is usually passed through the stories we tell, or through the stories we don't even tell. For instance, the silence around slavery. I believe for some of us, we probably heard stories about slavery, conflict, and all of that. But there are some other newer generations that they never heard any of those stories. They were never told because somehow their parents felt we were protecting them from all of those stories and protecting their mind and all of that. But sometimes this leaves the younger generation disconnected from their history. Another is genetic, what science calls genetic and epigenetic factors. And science now shows that trauma can alter how our genes function. I'm not a I'm not a deep scientist, but we can make more findings on this. And so science has shown over time that stress responses from past generations can literally be carried in our biological makeup, influencing how our offspring experience fear, anxiety, or resilience. The impact of all of this trauma is undeniable. It creates higher rates of mental health struggles, broken cultural connections, and even greater vulnerability exploitation. Eda had already explained how people tend to be even more vulnerable when they have mental health struggles. So all of these things contribute to it. And this is why true recovery requires community-based strategies that lift up even marginalized groups, that helps restore their dignity and also honor our cultural traditions of resilience and survival. Please, next slide. Now we are going to be looking at something very interesting. We are going to be looking at how some African communities healed long before even therapy came to be. The first is Ubuntu in South Africa. Ubuntu means I am because we are. Ubuntu is from the Zulu and Xhosa people in Southern Africa. And this way of healing, it means that they tend to explain the concept that, oh, it means my well-being is tied to your well-being. So if you are hurting, that means I feel it too, I should feel it too. And so, for example, when a child is sick or a child is sad, the whole family and sometimes even neighbor come around to comfort the child, to sing for the baby, to pet the baby and all of that. That togetherness brings healing, because healing is relational for many African communities. And this practice of Ubuntu is still being practiced widely even today, even outside South Africa. Another was the Gakaka courts in Rwanda, and it was a way of community reconciliation. So after the Rwandan genocide, people didn't go to big formal courts. Instead, communities came together in small village courts called Gakaka to talk, to confess, and to forgive each other and rebuild. So for them, healing was not just about the individual, it was about repairing the entire community. And it will interest you to know that handled through these Gakaka courts. But in 2012, the government officially closed Gakaka, but today it's still very much widely studied, and even some communities still practice it. Another was the Sankofa in Ghana. And the Sankofa is a bird, and this one was majorly practiced with the Akan people in southern Ghana, the Ashanti region. And it means learning from the past to move forward. So Sankofa is a bird that looks backward while moving forward. So it's like the head is faced backward and then it's moving forward. And that was how this concept came about. And it teaches us that we must not forget our past pains or mistakes. Instead, we learn from them so we can heal and grow stronger. And so survivors of harm often share their experience. They sit in circles and they share their experiences so that others can avoid same traps and also support each other. Another was the matriarchal circles in Kenya. And this was common among the Kikuyu and Luo communities in central and western Kenya. So in many Kenyan communities, women will gather in circles to talk, to pray, and to support each other. These were safe spaces where women could share their burdens, cry together, and guide one another to find strength. And lastly, the last one I'm going to talk about is the Groit-led narrative healing, which was in Mali, storytelling in Mali. And so in Mali, there are this set of people they called Groit. I don't know if I got the pronunciation right, but they are traditional storytellers. And so what they do is they use stories, songs, and history to heal emotional wounds. For example, if someone is discouraged, a Groit, which is a traditional storyteller, might tell the story of one of their ancient chiefs or one of their great kings who overcame disability to unite Mali. So hearing such stories usually give many people, many survivors, hope and courage to move on. And so these were some of the ways that many African communities worked through healing. So you see, in Africa, healing is not just about medicine or therapy. It's also about language, ritual, storytelling, spirituality, and most importantly, community-based support. Next slide, please. Now let's talk about where conventional or Western frameworks fall short in the African context in terms of trauma. First of all, let's look at cultural competence. Now, many Western models were built on individualism. By that, I mean, like, it involves majorly the survivor and the therapist in a room working on their mind, right? But in African societies, healing most times is also communal. So when we remove the family, the elders, the spiritual leaders like the pastors or the imams from the process, it's like you cut out a major part of how the person actually make meaning to find strength. So it's also very important for us to, when talking about cultural competence, also very important for us to remember spiritual diversity in African context. because for many Africans, there are so many religions in Africa. And so some Christians or Muslims may reject traditional healing practices, which is very okay. And while some people rooted in traditional beliefs may not find comfort in the church or mosque setting. And so we need to understand and respect everybody's individual culture and practices. So when working alongside survivors, these are some of the things we should also note. Else, if we force involving them in a practice that does not align with their belief, we risk alienating the survivor instead of helping them. Another way in which Western frameworks fall short is language barrier. So many psychology uses a lot of big terms like post-traumatic stress, dissociation, and all of that. But in many African languages, when you're trying to translate it, say for instance, EBBU, if I'm trying to translate post-traumatic stress in EBBU, I don't think it has like a word, right? So these words might not even exist in our local dialect. And so sometimes it becomes difficult for some people to understand what these terms actually mean. But the survivors will still find a way to relay how they feel. So instead, the survivor might say, oh, my heart is heavy, or I feel like a shadow is following me, or oh, a spirit of sadness has entered me, that kind of language. And if the therapist only understands clinical English, they might miss the depth of what the survivor is trying to describe. But when we also understand the local expression, we realize that, oh, this is trauma, this is grief, this is anxiety. And so language also matters a lot. Another way that the conventional Western framework falls short is accessibility and stigma. Like we've said over time, therapy, even when available, is often seen as something for, in many African societies, they still see it as something for those who are mad or who are insane. And so in some African communities, although now there's been some little awareness in this area, but many people still fear being labeled if they seek help. So for instance, a young man would rather go to a football field and talk to his friend about what he's going through than sit in an office with a therapist, because he might be thinking, oh, how would the community view me or see me if they know I'm talking to a therapist because of something, right? And on top of all of this stigma, there is affordability. Affordability is also a huge barrier. So imagine someone having to choose between paying for a therapy session and having to buy food for weeks, right? Because for many of us in Africa, survival will always come first. And so this is one of the things that makes conventional models impractical for the majority of Africans. And that's why we need frameworks that speak our language and respect our values. I would like to clearly note that Afrocentric trauma-informed care doesn't replace mainstream or Western models. Instead, it enriches them. It brings together the wisdom of our traditions and the tools of modern psychology to create a care that is even more inclusive, relatable, and effective. And so in conclusion, understanding a person's cultural background should not just be an extra step in care. It should be central to providing real and effective support. I would like us to also understand that true healing happens when cultures meet. So the Western and the Afrocentric approaches, they need to learn from each other. We need to collaborate and also work side by side. And this is where transformation begins. This also means we need to take time to carry out cultural assessment when we first meet with survivors. We need to understand survivors' values, their traditions, and even their preferred means of healing. We can't force a Muslim survivor to take part in church activities when we know very well that, oh, they're Muslim and this is how they would like to relate with their God and all of that. So it also means encouraging peer-led support groups like the African Survival Coalition, where survivors can share their own coping strategies and cultural practices. Because like Eva also mentioned, survivors are experts of their own lived experience, and so they know better. Thank you so much.
Wow. This is, in fact, we are diving really into why we are here. Two things I would like to mention again that Joy shared. One is we cannot force survivors to accept certain frameworks. When we do that, we alienate them. Healing practices should align with their cultures. This is so profound. The other one is we are not trying to replace the Western frameworks, but we want them enriched with our cultural beliefs so that it can be balanced for anyone who is in need of these resources. Thank you so much, Joy. I mean, it's beautiful to hear all of this and to learn from you. We are going next into, please 1 minute, trauma resilience, mental health stigma in Africa by Lucia Lynch. Lucia Lynch is the Trauma Resilience and Research Coordinator for Footprint to Freedom. I believe that Lucia's knowledge would help frame this whole information that we've received better and also help us to go through the remaining courses. So please do not log out. I believe that as you advance, you find out that every of these courses were fashioned to make sure that you have enough information and resources to do your work as you progress. Thank you so much. Lucia, over.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I know that the discussion on mental health can be a draining one. So just a reminder for everyone to take care of themselves as we carry on speaking through this. And thank you so much, Joy and Heather, for setting this conversation up so perfectly for me. To start by talking about mental health stigma in Africa. So before we begin, obviously you can see I'm white, and so as a white South African, I want to begin by recognizing my own position and intersections. So I cannot pretend to fully understand the lived experiences of survivors of stigma or the depth of Afrocentric approaches to health, to mental health. But what I can do is I can be here with you all. I can listen, I can learn, and then I can pass this knowledge forward and transmit the knowledge I have learned and have been entrusted with to all of you. And a lot of you are already experts in this field. So this is sure to ensure that the voices and the wisdom of those that are at the center are carried forward with respect. So let's start by asking everyone here today a question. It doesn't matter where you're from or anything. What have you ever felt like you couldn't talk about what you were going through? It's a very, from childhood all the way here, is there ever been a time that you haven't been able to talk about something you've been going through? So you can put the answer in the chat or write it down if you don't feel comfortable. I'll give you a couple minutes. Okay, let me see if I can access this chat. Yeah. Let's see. We're getting some yeses in the chat. And I'm not going to put anyone at the spotlight, but I think that not being able to speak about things is a universal experience, no matter where you're from. And I think it all ties back to stigma. So what is stigma? Stigma is a concept that involves the shame, silence, and discrimination. So feeling like you're not able to say something because you are afraid of feeling shame or because you feel silenced and you do not want to be discriminated against. It has 3 different levels. So the first being self-stigma, which involves how we see ourselves. In mental health in particular, say you have depression, not being able to address this and say, or fully internalize it. I'm depressed, I have depression, or I have anxiety, is how we view ourselves. So this self-stigma and feeling shameful or silenced because within yourself. So that is an individual experience, which is often external because all of these levels of stigma are interconnected. So we might feel self-stigma because of social stigma, which involves how others treat us. In Africa in particular, say someone has a mental health disability or a mental health disorder like depression, anxiety, bipolar, PTSD, they're afraid to say something, perhaps, in their community because they don't want to feel the shame or feel dismissed. So that is social stigma, the norms around a certain concept. And finally, there is structural stigma, which is a little more complex, but it's how systems and institutions respond to different stigmas. So this can be discrimination laws, restrictive policies for people with mental health, and institutional practices that create inequitable care, like underfunding mental health research, lower staff for mental health, or lower quality of treatment. So combining all these things, oh, we don't need to put money towards this because people don't need it. Structural stigma, it's against something that is stigmatized. It's also important to note that stigma is a global concept. It's not tied to Africa, and there can be stigma for anything anywhere. Joy mentioned this earlier. For instance, boys don't cry. That's a sentence that is stigmatizing for men, and that's often a global experience. At the same time, maybe this is not the truth for Africa. I also recognize that stigma is not the reality everywhere in Africa. But talking about the darkest parts, I think, remain important because we can confront them honestly and we can see how we can grow from them and how healing is possible together. And through being all here together is just an example. So let's watch this video. It is from Kenya, and it's talking about collective stigma and how that is a barrier to mental health care.
A wave of protests hit Kenya these past months as anger.
We can hear it, Joy.
Oh, you can hear it?
Mm-hmm.
I thought you weren't hearing it. I think
No, we could hear it.
A wave of protests hit Kenya these past months as anger over tax hikes and the cost of living spilled into the streets. Anger, frustration and fear, all having a deep impact on people's lives.
So some of the main causes that we have noted to have maybe contributed to mental health conditions or issues, we can talk of economic hardships right now in the country. So many people are trying so hard to, let's say, make a living, and in these times depression kicks in and people don't have the control over their mental health.
The sleeplessness, I haven't slept for like 3 days now.
But for many like Joyce Mugure, who struggled for many years with bipolar disorder, it takes time to find the courage to ask for help.
I didn't know what I was going through. So all my life I've been feeling different. I've faced a lot of stigma and discrimination because most people around me didn't understand what I was going through. Nobody knew it was an illness. Until one day when I was very suicidal, I saw someone advocating for mental health online, and I reached out to them.
The Psychiatric Disability Organization in Kenya estimates around 2 million people are living with mental health issues. The organization offers therapy sessions at moderate rates with services for people who can't afford the payments. If not handled, mental health issues can have devastating consequences. The World Health Organization estimates that Africa has the world's highest rates of suicide in the world. Breaking down taboos around admitting to suffering psychological distress is key to bringing the numbers down. Gladys Mwiti is a psychologist. She shares her recipe for good mental health.
Do not take it for granted when you are finding you cannot sleep, because insomnia is related to stress, and the stress then will lead you to depression. So make sure you sleep well, exercise, eat well, and then get support around yourself. Make sure you have 1 or 2 friends that you can run to at any time of night or day.
So although it's short and it doesn't cover everything, but I think this video is a testament to the crisis that there is in Africa, the mental health crisis. And it all stems from not just barriers to healthcare, but from fear. So stigma and fear are two things that are incredibly tied. Mental health is obviously something that it can be scary because it's the unknown. So by having these conversations, by talking about stigma, can start breaking this wall down and allow people to access care. But right now, survivors and stigma are two things that also have gone hand in hand. So we're obviously in a place full of experts, and I can imagine that fear of accessing health is one of the greatest barriers. And in fact, 10%, only 10%, we had this question at the beginning of this class, but only 10% of survivors of human trafficking have ever accessed mental health services, which is incredibly low and incredibly unfair and unjust, considering that mental health is a right. So why is this? And it's largely because they fear, or people fear, accessing this care because of shame and silence, and it makes it impossible to seek help, or afraid to seek help. So what are the effects of this? So it will touch on families, clinics, and survivor sense of self. And so beyond, so here are a couple of reasons of why stigma has been built up in Africa in particular. For one, Joy also mentioned this, the beliefs that if you have are experiencing some mental health disorder, is it because of witchcraft, spiritual imbalance, and it's a form of punishment. Also barriers to health. So there's few services, so the less we know about it, the less open people will be to accessing care. There's a lack of providers, it's expensive, and then there's also gendered stigma behind it. So on one hand, women are silenced and blamed about their mental health, and then male survivors are denied access to care because they have to be strong and they cannot cry. And these are two things which eventually is a self-fulfilling negative cycle, because survivors will keep silent and pain becomes bottled. Obviously, here today, we have so many survivors that are speaking up and against stigma, and this is first conversation, an important conversation to breaking down these cultural norms. Which also, another impact of stigma is the delayed access to care, and then deepening this shame and guilt and isolation. And then communities will lose their voice of healing and resilience. So by cutting down this error right in the middle, talking about it, that is one of the main solutions to stigma, and to break this cycle of 10%. We need to change this 10%. And so thank you for all being here and changing this 10% by just speaking about it, by just talking about stigma, by talking about discrimination, the feelings we feel, the silence, the blame, is a solution towards ending it and accessing care and changing this 10%. So I'm going to finish off this section with a quote from a survivor that says, "If you show weakness, people pull away. They avoid you. So I stayed silent for years until I met other survivors who understood without judging. That changed everything. These judgment-free, safe spaces are what changes people from being silent to being loud. And by doing that, again, not just stigma, but changes and ends horrible crimes." So thank you so much for listening and for the first section.
Thank you so much, Lucia. Your session is so exceptional, helping us to understand what the angle that you came from, helping us to see that there are solutions, there are things that we could do to ensure that survivors access mental health care, one of which you mentioned that survivors, when there's no need to keep silent anymore, find where you can actually speak up about what you're going through. Again, we need to address the 10%. We need to make that change. It shouldn't be 10%. I mean, there's just a lot of survivors, so why 10% only? There is a need to up the numbers and make sure that people have access to these resources. We're going next into the next session by Malaika. Please, 1 minute. Malaika Oringo is the founder of and CEO of Footprints to Freedom and the director of the African Survival Coalition. Malaika, please, over to you. Thank you. Also, before Malaika takes the mic, please, if you have any questions, put them in the chat box. I forgot to mention that at the very beginning. They will be addressed at the end of the training. Your questions in the chat box is not being ignored. You can see that I'm also attending to it to make sure that you don't feel like your questions are being ignored. But yes, at the end of the training, our trainers would address your questions. Thank you so much. Malaika, over to you.
Thank you very much. Is my mic on?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for this masterclass and hearing from diverse experts and diverse nationality and diverse experiences. One thing I want to flag in that before we get in depth, I think I want everyone in the call, especially not the speakers, okay, it's even the speakers. Why did you decide to join this masterclass? I think it has to start with the why. Secondly, you just type in for a personal reason. I, for one, maybe I'll start by saying that I wanted to understand where the Afrocentric and the Western approach meet. I cannot understand that if I'm just focusing on the lens of the Afrocentric perspective. So we need to understand the why. And also wanted to flag in that this understanding trauma is part of the African Survival Coalition Academy initiative, not only in equipping frontliners, just like you experts, on how to internally immerse yourself to understand what is it that I'm dealing with before I start serving others. It has been clear in our last can I call them interviews and Google research to understand what is the percentage, what is your state when it comes to trauma. It came clear that a lot of our leaders have not accessed it, they've not yet understood it, and we cannot serve others without cleaning our house first. And this is the idea why we are having this conversation. So I can understand most of the things that you might have known them, you might have even heard about them, but we are speaking from a place of authenticity, experience, beyond clinical understanding. And I'm glad to hear from Heather, who has been able to bridge that perspective, working with African survivors, working from Europeans to Americans, and hearing from narrowing down how does it look like in the Afrocentric way. And with now hearing from Lucia, mainly when it comes to Africa, even though it's global, like stigma in Africa is the core barrier to people accessing and understanding trafficking. I just want to flag into having a discussion with you as lived experience, because I think the highest percentage people on call are survivors of human trafficking. How would we interpret it from our first understanding, and how do we carry it over to people we serve every day? So I start with this question. The wounds might be invisible, but they live in our body, the memory and the spirit. To heal, we must name them first. It has been acknowledged by Joy that most of the terminologies do not have a name, but we cannot cure anything, even though it's headache. You cannot get medication or any diagnosis treated if it doesn't have a name. And this is the issue with Africa when we talk about trauma and whatever terminology is around it, it has not been yet named. So there are a bit like 5 elements. I didn't want to repeat myself because some of the information have been shared. That trauma lives in our body, we all agree. When I growing up, I thought that trauma is in my head. That's why we're thinking that it's only, you should be wrong with your head to have trauma, but it's in the body. What sign do we see in survivors and that words may not capture? I'm starting with these questions because this training we are doing, workshop, is kind of a teaser to a real bigger training that you are going to do further, which is going to answer this in depth. Maybe I want to give an opportunity for somebody to answer this question. What sign do we see in survivors that words do not capture? Can I have one volunteer? Anybody? Because they gave me 15 minutes. I can't see any hand up. Is that because the question is hard or the way I framed it? Okay. I didn't want to spoon feed you today. I just wanted us to have a conversation, and we are going to continue having this conversation. Yes, Chilean.
Hi, Malaika. We have one response in the chat box. We have someone said courage. And then another person said, could you please ask the question again so that they can answer? Sorry.
So if trauma lives in our body, what signs do we see in survivors that words may not capture? I might give you an example. I was misdiagnosed with trauma because everyone said I'm too calm and too cool. There's no way Malaika should be having trauma. Because my facial and body expression was saying something else. So to answer that question,
we have two answers.
Yes.
Yes. We have
maybe Gillian, you could answer them because I don't see the
yes, that's sorry. So someone said they look timid.
Yeah.
2 other people said determination and courage.
Okay. We are going to keep those ones in mind. These questions are going to define the next stage of training because we want to make it practical. You know, sometimes we talk about trauma in a more conceptualized, theoretical way, but then Malaika is coming to you, she looks so cool, she has combed her wig and she's just so calm. You said this one is a tick, she's not traumatized. So we want to go in depth to understand real life when you meet these survivors, what will you do? So we're going to keep those answers aside. We're going to answer them at the end. We're going to use them at the end. So another element is memory. So it's the body, it's the memory. How do unspoken or silenced memories shape the way survivors navigate their daily life? Can I have 2 volunteers? How do unspoken or silenced memories shape the way survivors navigate daily lives, especially from the African perspective? Have you experienced, especially when you're working with survivors, or when you yourself, let me give an example of myself. Instead, they talked about avoidance, they talked about freeze and fright. Our memories capture a lot of trauma events. Some we forget, we choose to forget them, and some we choose to remember. For me, I was using avoidance. Everyone who met me, I'll tell them about my mother because she was one positive element that I wanted to divert myself from unblocking the real trauma. So the reason we're asking about this is for you, when survivors or you're working with victims that are coming into your centers, you're able to embody these two thematic subject matters. What does the body say? In her sentence, when we talk about memory, what is coming up? I'm going to rush through this. Then there is spirit. In African context, healing often includes spirituality. We love going to church, isn't it? So what role can culture, spiritual practice play in trauma recovery? I think Joy has mentioned that. Any suggestions? Chilean, do we have anybody on? Okay.
No, we don't.
No. So which gives me a good feeling. Actually, this was a teaser to see if discourse and writing this, expanding on this is so needed. It seems that it's a gray area. We might understand what trauma it is, but how to apply it when we are faced in real life experience is the major end goal of this training, of the academy, translating this knowledge into practice. So I'll just give a small response. I think one of it is just reconnection. Spirit and culture reconnects a person onto their body and their spirit. When it comes to the Afrocentric perspective, it becomes the Trinity. It just brings the person back together. So what does naming trauma look like in the communities where stigma is silenced and mental health is not acknowledged? And collective, how can we create safe spaces where survivors can name these wounds without fear of judgment and re-traumatization? So this question you reflect on, you're going to reflect on, please answer them in the chat. But this is going to be the next phase of this part of my presentation. Just a recap. Trauma and PTSD are entwined. They are kind of serious relatives. We experience them in different ways, as it was already indicated by Heather and Joy. But I just want to flag in one thing, that trauma is the emotional response to an overwhelming event. In some cases, I want to give an example. If it's war, if it's climate change, if loss, or if it's abuse. Why do I bring this back? I had an experience of when I was young. I come from Uganda. In the past, I think 30 years, we were bombarded by continuous wars, I think since the times of 70s. So we would have never gotten a break. When I was young, I'd never known a life that is without war. So you can imagine that your brain and system is just trauma and abuse, and PTSD is just the way of life. But then there were in videos that come from the northern part of Uganda, they're from Gulu. When there was a bit of a balance of the war, it was getting a bit better. People used to talk about those people like they are violent, they are very closed, and they are not very inclusive. You're going to meet these kind of people in your service who are having past trauma, and these people are part of the third generation of the initial wars and how trauma dealt with them. So it's very important for us also to think about the history as it was mentioned. So also understanding, if somebody comes to me, which are kind of these pinpointing terminologies that can make me work, that I can work on. The person is talking about flashback, maybe is avoiding answering this question, numbness. In the recent research, it has been noticed, and also I know for sure that, especially from survivors of human trafficking, in being identified as victim, the process of interview, they mainly express two things. They're either crying a lot and not speaking, or they're numb, which makes them, in the process of being identified as victims, that less survivors are identified at the first 3 months, because most of them either are exhibiting numbness or avoidance. So what does that call us for as people working with them? That we have to really work on this key element and see how we can resolve them. So trauma often is not described in psychological terms when it comes to Africa, as it already indicated. Now, a quick one. So in Africa, we express PTSD in a different ways. For example, in Zimbabwe, I hear if somebody's traumatized, say, man, you are thinking too much. And then that terminology is always there. And then they don't deal with the real problem. Ghana, Nigeria, and across Africa is that trauma is really related to spirit possession. And in Uganda now, we are advancing, we're calling it chronic pain. Rwanda, because of that, after the genocide, that the reconciliation is not only forcing them, requiring them to forgive, then they have this social withdrawal of their own feelings because they really have to forgive. It also, the government tells them to do so, and the community decided on that element that forgiveness should be a key of dealing with trauma. Then in Nigeria also it talks about it as nightmares and visions. I want two suggestions from the team, from the people on the call. How do people express trauma when someone is talking about trauma? Which words do they use? Anybody? In Uganda, we used to call them the mad people.
Yes, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Ross.
Yes, from our side, if somebody is going through trauma, they tell me like you're having some mental challenge.
Oh, mental challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That is very, also across Africa, is really vibrant. Any other suggestion from any other country? That is from Gambia. Any suggestion? Can I hear from Kenya? We've just had a good video from Kenya, and I've seen a lot of Kenyan counterparts on the call. How do we call trauma in Swahili?
Hello,
Okay.
everyone. In
Hi.
Kenya, In Kenya, it's like a mental issue, and we call it in Swahili, mwenda wazimu.
Mwendo wazimu.
I've gone through, yes.
So you can imagine how anybody wants to be associated with that. Other terms that are associated with trauma and PTSD is laziness. That person doesn't want to do something. That one person wants to sleep a lot. So we're coming from that background. So why am I bringing this together? I wanted to be as practical as possible in order to understand trauma, the awareness, and also serving those ones who are experiencing it. We need to give it a name. And if in Ghana, it is spirit possession, we need to first address it in that context. One thing that is happening is that once a person comes to you You say spirit possession. Now that you know about the scientific explanation, you say Holy Ghost fire. There's no way this can happen. Trauma is ABCD. You need to meet the people where they are, try to understand where they their expression of what they're feeling, and then start bringing in the clinical psychological part of serving these people. Do we agree on this? Have we been rushing people when they say I have chronic pain or I'm thinking too much? Then you rush them and say, I don't think you need to talk about thinking too much. You need to talk about trauma. You need to take either medicine or you need to do these other things. We should acknowledge these terminologies, because in this way, then we can support them from their own awareness. To bring the external awareness, we need to walk their shoes and also try to understand what do they experience in this, if it's nightmare, and then translate nightmares into the scientific understanding. So I can imagine Joy spoke about one of the areas that people are dealing with trauma is prayers, and it has been an essential aspect of Africans dealing with traumatic events. But my question is, what if what we call spiritual attack is really trauma? How could you address it? In practice? Malaika comes to Chilean, say, hi, Chilean. I think for the last 3 years, spiritual attacks are coming. I don't sleep well. Something comes and holds my chest. Maybe I'm sleepwalking. The spirit is carrying me, wants to take me to the water. What would be the first statement that you could give the person? Well, Bernadette.
Thank you, Malaika. For me, if this is a new person for me, like a person that I'm not used to talking with, I will encourage them to like talk to me about their experience. Because most of the time, as I don't remember who said that, but most of the time we tend to kind of not forget, but block what really happened when we are seeking to have like peace, etc. And sometimes we have these flashbacks, memory is coming back, and unconsciously, as long as we tend it to forget what happened, it's kind of always coming back. And what I've experienced also is like there are different levels of traumas, which sometimes can tend to, you can feel like you are seeing something and you are feeling something while it's all in your head, and you just need someone to talk to give you reassurance. And after understanding that, then you can guide that person to get the proper help. I think that's what I could do for me.
Yeah. You know, every approach is right. And I like the way you brought that you need to think about all possible ways. But I think the first rule of engagement is listening first. Yes, I see.
Yes.
Gandhi. Did I mention your name well?
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Good evening, Malaika. Actually, you said what I wanted to say. I was just like trying to say, first of all, listen the person without just listen. Maybe at a point you hold the hand to give her courage. In so doing, by holding the physical hand, you will then know the pressure or the movement of the touch you're having. You will know the various emotions she's trying or he's trying to carry. He's carrying out when he's narrating the story. So that's what I wanted to say actually. For now, for me, I will just listen first of all.
That is very, very good. And I'm glad to hear something that I myself, I would love to learn more. Please, we'll come back to you to understand, because you say the emotions in the body language, as we said, trauma speaks in the body, and the body remembers, and the body communicates. And you were listening to the body and how the movements of the hands and how the movements of the body to direct you, which I think is very essential. I think we're going to get back to you to just kind of understand how we could also bring it to into our training, or in the next training, to bring you to kind of explain that better, because sometimes we think we need to practice. You need to envision a person standing in front of you and do A, B, C, D in practice. That's when you know that sometimes the theory is different from the actual occurrence. Thank you for those tips and the tools. Yes, I see Samsung A1X5F. I think your name was registered as Samsung. Please, could you give your comment?
Yeah, this is Patience Piri.
Oh,
I
Patience,
don't know.
Samsung.
Yeah, I didn't know I didn't register. Okay. Yeah, in spiritual point of view, trauma can be misunderstood as say lack of faith. You are having all these problems because you don't have faith. You are not a Christian enough, and then it goes further. It triggers you more because it's like.
Can somebody unmute the mic? Okay, thank you, Patience. Continue.
Yes, it's like you were looking for that support, and now this person comes saying that they are still blaming you for lacking of faith. Say you don't have faith, that's why all these stuff are coming to you. So it can like in my context, it can be misunderstood like that.
Okay, thank you for plugging that in. The misunderstanding is misunderstood, and actually most of the time. Yes, I see Chilean, your hand up.
Oh, okay. Just one thing I wanted to touch on is also how we listen, because sometimes we listen with a lot of judgments, coming from our region, where we know that there's hardly the belief that what is happening is mental health issues. So your expression while you're listening to the person, how you're reacting to everything the person is saying. I know that there are people who, when they are listening, they have a lot of big expressions like, hey, things like that can actually discourage the person from even continuing the conversation. You actually listen and make sure that you're not expressing anything that would discourage the person from seeking further help.
Thank you for bringing in also the characteristics of listening and with empathy, and also being sensitive that the people talking to us are also watching our body language. But one thing I'm missing in this conversation, but there are real spiritual attacks, because it seems like everyone has come to you is good trauma related. How do we link the difference between trauma and real spiritual attacks? All spiritual attacks don't exist.
From my side, Malika,
Yeah.
Before answering that, the other way wherein you can help somebody relieve from trauma is like, sometimes they say peer-to-peer connect. So like if you meet me and tell me that you're going through some things, and like for you to feel comfortable sharing your story with me, I can relate my story to you, so that can make us connect. You can know that, okay, this is a safe space for me to talk to. This is somebody that can understand or feel what I am going through, because he or she has already been there. So whatever I say, we can connect with each other. And secondly, for the spiritual attack that you're talking about, there is a way we can differentiate it. Because like For me, I know, yes, spiritual attack exists, and it's different from trauma, because trauma, sometimes people might come to you telling you, I'm seeing things. It's left with you now to discern, because like based on your conversation, you can know that this person have gone through ABC that relates to what he or she is seeing. So that can make you to know that this is not spiritual attack. This person is going through trauma, because based on their story, their past keep haunting them. It makes it appear to them like nightmare or stuff like that. While spiritual attack now, it can be something relating to, as the name goes, spiritual things, wherein you can just wake up or you can be in your sleep, just see you being chased by masquerade and these other things. So it's two different things that we should try to differentiate and know that when somebody is going through trauma, the likelihood is that if they are not tackled at the early stage, it might lead to some kind of medical complication that will be hard to solve.
Thank you. I like the way we're having this conversation. I use this approach because in order for us to build a comprehensive, survivor-informed and survivor-led Afrocentric trauma-informed care, it needs the wisdom have to come from all of us. So you see how we are able to kind of bring a better framework on how we address trauma, either from a spiritual angle, from a medical angle. But at the end of the day, you need to position yourself that if you're not specialized in mental health, you need to have a referral mechanism that in your place, in your organization, to refer this person. One thing that is lacking in Africa, we identify people with these, either spiritual attacks or either mental health. But then we do not have a mechanism for these people to seek solutions. I think it's one of the most important elements that identification has to come with a solution. So that is able to help this person really get the right help the person needs. We'll dive in this further in the normal training that we are going to do. That is going to be found in Academy. I'm seeing Chilean's hand up. Maybe we just got stuck there.
No, Malaika, sorry.
Okay. So all those components that are brought together, it shows that it's very, very important that we name trauma. We give it a name that is contextual to Liberia, that is contextual to South Africa, that is contextual to Rwanda, so that we can communicate to people in the language that resonates with them. So naming it does not erase the spirituality, or saying naming it, giving it a clinical perspective does not change its spirituality as you intended. You mentioned it just expands the understanding and making somebody get help. So these questions will be answered in the training in Academy. So please don't hesitate to do the follow-up on this workshop. I think I have a few minutes left. I wanted to just give you an example. There is this girl, Ada, from West Africa, was trafficked to North Africa. During the journey, she was abused. After rescue, she's experiencing silence, numbness, chronic stomach pain. Her father was once a political prisoner. Her community sees her as cursed. I just want two answers. What trauma symptoms do you notice in Ada's situation? Anybody? Or do you see intergenerational trauma present in Ada's story? Okay. We are going to diagnose this scenario in the next training because of the time. I think it will be better for us to do the things in practice. That's why I brought these scenarios here. Has anybody got any suggestion? What could be the symptoms here? We've heard from Heather, we heard from Joy, we heard from Luthier. We see the word numbness. We see the term chronic stomach pain. The father, there's a political prisoner, making it that she's maybe experiencing intergenerational trauma. So this also makes me make it clear that we need more practical ways on how to understand how this trauma and PSD is how do you say exposes itself in different situations. So there were, okay, I think I missed So there's Jane, also a domestic worker from Middle East. She has been dreaming of drowning and she has insomnia. Her job is affected, leading to more abuse. 10 years earlier, during the flood in her home country, she lost her young sister. She couldn't save her. These elements are actually typical people who have walked into Footprint Center, and maybe they walked into your services. Do you see an element of PTSD? Maybe Lucia, can you just give one plug-in?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can see that she has bad dreams, and insomnia, which are two PTSD symptoms.
Okay. Thank you for flagging that in. We'll expand this in our next topic. And this next topic, I just want everyone to get immersed when you're doing this training, because until you put this theory into practice, you're not going to be able to help the people you serve effectively. So in a recap, you can see that the key elements in the conversation or in this story is that there's recurring dreams, there's insomnia, current abuse of from the employer, death of the sister, the 10 years gap, failure to sell the sibling, and the physical location as a trigger. So we would expand this on further in the next training. I just wanted to just recap that trauma refers to emotional response to distressing event, and PTSD develops when symptoms persist long after the traumatic event has happened and disrupting someone's daily and functioning life. So in Jane's situation, it's just, you can see that it's a classic PTSD pattern. Here are some of the takeaway, even drawn from Heather, drawn from Joy, drawn from Lucia, that again, trauma globally, and especially in Africa, is complex. Complex in the way that it's everything that is related to socioeconomic, political, and everything. Everything sometimes is so wrong that a person comes to you with a very ginormous past experience of trauma. We have to consider that. But one thing that is also that I've observed that is often collective or intergenerational, that it makes it very difficult to cry or cry out in a situation where, for example, I grew up in a war zone during that time. You cannot complain when everyone is going through the same thing, and then you'll be the one just whining. So the community is collectively going through this. That's why we need to leverage on collective healing. It's either simultaneously or spiritually, and often invisible due to the stigma, as it has indicated. I just want to close by saying that how does this relate to human trafficking? survivors often have multiple layers of trauma. Most of us end up becoming victims of trafficking with layers that have happened way back when we're young, from either physical, sexual abuse, or either loss of freedom, separation, either a lot of things that can really affect a person's mental health. So bear that in mind. There's a saying that be kind to anybody you see, because you don't know what somebody's going through, because you cannot see it by face value. Trauma may resurface. That's why there should be continuous support. There's no timeline that a person comes to your maybe place of work or NGO looking for support and then say within 1 year you are healed, then you can move on with your life. It should be consistent. Keep on checking on survivors or create that peer-to-peer counseling that could help. And lastly, understanding and contextualizing trauma is essential. One size fits all does not help. So at the end of the day, not all wounds are visible, and not all pain is spoken, but it all deserves to be understood. And in this way, we'll be able to package and support survivors from the place of their mental health, or we begin to support them from the place of their mental health, but on how they holistically might need support from us. Thank you for this opportunity. Back to you, Chilean.
Thank you so much, Malaika, so profound. I just want to recap on 3 things that you mentioned. When you were starting, you said, we cannot help others without understanding it. It starts from our home. And there is a saying here, I'll say it in my language and I will explain what it means. What they mean is, if you want people to appreciate the dance you're doing or to enjoy the dance you're doing, it means you must have done a lot of the dancing in your own house before stepping out, which means you've taken care of yourself. You know that dance requires strength, you've eaten well, you've made sure that you're well built for what you're going to face, so that the people who you're dancing for or you're dancing with would also enjoy the dance. So that's how it came to me, and I thought to share that. Again, we need to meet survivors where they are. We don't have to downplay what they are going through. I know that sometimes you want to interpret what the person is saying, and the moment they say it, there's an I don't know if I can call it unconscious bias. There's an idea. As an African, I know that sometimes when people are sharing their experiences, there's already an idea in your head. You just put that idea aside and remember that there is this issue of not dealing with trauma, and try to listen first, just like you mentioned, to make sure that the person gets the kind of help that they need. Survivors often have multiple layers of trauma. We need to be kindness, especially as a community. Thank you so much, Malaika. This would help us in our work and in the various ways we support others. First, we have to take care of ourselves. The next session would be Survivor Mental Health, Empowerment and Resilience by Kendall Alaimo. I hope I've not used my Nigerian tongue to mention your name. Kendall is a human rights activist and an internationally recognized artist. She works and speaks on mental health as well. So Kendall, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to learn from you a lot. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being here with the African Survivor Coalition and Footprint to Freedom. Thank you very much. Again, my name is Kendall Alaimo. I am an international activist against trafficking. I'm also a survivor of child trafficking. I'm also a human living with post-traumatic stress disorder. And I always say the most important part of that sentence is I'm living with it. And I get the opportunity to go out in the world and educate people on my lived experience with it and my knowledge of mental health and access to mental health. I'm also a professionally trained artist, and I make paintings and do performances. I also consider my speaking part of my art. So, and I am based in Chicago, but consider myself a global citizen. So here I am, and I will get started. And one thing we've been talking about today that's really encouraging to me, and I'm hearing this theme in this training, is the word stigma keeps coming up. And I think that's really important and really crucial, especially in different cross-cultural contexts. I'm based here in America, but I know around the world, mental health, talking about mental health openly can be more challenging in places like Africa or Asia. So I'm really happy to be in this space today to break down that very stigma. But when I think about stigma, something comes to mind to me is the word shame. And I think we had mentioned that before. And when we think about what's the opposite of shame, is pride. And I actually feel like people should be proud of themselves. Actually, we can kind of reverse the narrative and say, instead of saying I'm ashamed that I went through this, say I'm proud that I went through this because I'm resilient, right? And when we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder and clinical symptomatology and kind of pathologizing people in a sense for just merely being normal people who went through an abnormal experience. And when I think about stigma, I think sometimes we might hear the word crazy, right? Or we say this person must be crazy. Well, they're not crazy people. They're normal people that went through an abnormal experience. And by clinical definition, they're really just resilient people. And so I think we really need to replace the word shame with pride. And instead of judging or isolating these people, I think we need to celebrate them. And, by research, we know the more trauma one goes through, the more higher levels of trauma one goes through, the more higher levels of clinical symptomatology and mental health clinical symptoms they're going to have. And so really, when we see somebody that has this level of clinical pathology, they also need this level of inclusion and celebration for that very resiliency. So I did want to mention stigma very quickly. And it's interesting too, is like, then we need to ask the question, why are people not talking about this, not just because of shame and isolation and lack of resources, but really foundationally, for me, this is something I think about a lot, is not just the fear of the person disclosing, I'm too scared to tell another human being, but really that human being or that person that could help might also have fear, right? And so I think about this concept a lot. Maybe, for example, in my own context, right? Like if you're a human, and I'm a human and I've gone through a really traumatic situation, I might want to tell you, and I assume people have compassion and are able to hold it for me. But really what happens is when I tell another person, they might want to inherently be compassionate, but there's this psychological turning away from the person needing to disclose, not because there's a lack of compassion, but there's fear. And so that person that receives it might think, I care about Kendall, I love Kendall, I want to be inherently compassionate as a person, but I'm turning away psychologically because the story I'm telling myself is, my goodness, if that happened to Kendall, that can happen to me. And that's too scary to think that if this person is a human and they experience this narrative and I'm a human, that's really threatening psychologically. And so there's this psychological turning away from those that need to disclose to protect themselves in not to blame, but I just would say really like we need to have the courage to turn towards our own narrative first. We're talking about dissociation in this, which is sometimes when we block out trauma. So the courage within ourselves as survivors to turn towards our own narrative, and then the secondary courage of other people to bravely turn towards that narrative. First say, this happened to Kendall, this means it could happen to me, and I'm going to sit with this discomfort, and I'm going to be brave enough to know that this happens to people, and this could also happen to me. So this is something I just wanted to touch on as far as stigma, because that seemed like a really important piece today. Again, Heather did a wonderful job, Malika, Lucia, everybody's done wonderful kind of touching on what post-traumatic stress disorder is and kind of breaking down some of the symptoms. Things that I've seen in myself or the survivor population as far as mental health, I'll just go through them quickly because I think everybody did just a fantastic job today. Things I've really noticed is, post-traumatic stress disorder. which means hypervigilance, nightmares, avoidance, shutting down. Another thing we see in this population is eating disorders. And I think in a clinical context, what I want to touch on that too is sometimes survivors go into eating disorder treatment programs, and there's sometimes like trauma around food, right? When I was trafficked as a little girl, food was kept from me. And so my relationship with food was really challenging. And I think this is something that clinicians are missing, is that when you're working with a trafficking survivor in the context of eating disorders, they need to understand part of that narrative can be withholding food or having drugs put in food, and really the complicated, almost like a disorganized attachment with food. We really need it to sustain ourselves, but we really fear it at the same time. So eating disorders, I think Heather or Malik, I don't know who mentioned it, but really attachment, right? Some attachment disturbances. And so ideally, we always want to shoot for a secure attachment. We're comfortable being in relationship with ourselves. We're comfortable being in relationship with other people. There is anxious attachment, where you really have a fear of abandonment. And then, avoidant attachment, I think was mentioned earlier, where you have a fear of being in relationship. And then sometimes in this population, we see something called disorganized attachment, which is both anxious and avoidant, where you really want to be in relationship, but you fear it at the same time. So part of healing needs to be obtaining secure attachment. Another thing we see is addiction, right? Because that serves survivors to numb out and not be able to have to feel or process their narrative. So addiction is something we see in this population. Another thing I'm really big on talking about too is phobias, right? And we had talked about avoidance, something I do. Sometimes I'll pick up a little pink marker here, but I do these little examples. So, for example, when we talk about avoidance, right, like there's an external stimuli. So say I walk down the street and I got hit by a pink marker 20 years ago, and it really, really hurt me. I could have blocked it out. I could be aware of it. But now 20 years later, I'm walking past a pink marker. And like Heather had mentioned, my whole body can respond on a biological level. I'm shortness of breath. I feel dizzy, or I can just see this outside of my line of vision and I avoid it, right? So I don't want to come in contact with this threat. And this is how our body sustains and survives, right? That's a threat. I should probably move past it. And so this is kind of like a visual example of avoidance. So this can happen, obviously with a marker, but so many dynamics in trafficking, right? And when I think about trafficking in the context of avoidance, we're really talking about survivors developing a multitude of avoidance, right? And for me, it was, sometimes, and I'll be transparent because I think there's beauty in that, and I'm going to practice authenticity today. I still struggle with, staying in a hotel or getting on an airplane, or elements of my trafficking that I want to avoid but have to kind of push through. Or I was forced to work in a really abusive way. So work has been, a challenge for me historically, or a phobia of work. And I think we're really missing that in this population, because as we know, survivors aren't really free upon exit. It takes a community, mental health resources, housing, and economic equity to sustain your own freedom. But when survivors have a phobia of work because they were forced to work in an abusive context, I think that's something we need to have conversations about, is phobias that are developed specifically from trafficking situations, and how to mitigate those phobias, and how to create things like safe work, for example, or reparative work that feels empowering and led from self-agency to make equity and to be having sustained freedom. So I did want to touch on the phobia of work, but we've talked so much about mental health, and I've definitely researched trauma and mental health for many, many years in my life. Currently, I'm researching the biological impacts of slavery. A couple of months ago, I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, and I thought, oh, here we go. I'm a case study for this, because I had known for a very long time survivors, very unfortunately, down the road, if they don't do the nervous system healing or don't have the resources, they can have autoimmune disease or cancer later in life. And so my own diagnosis has inspired me this year to do research on the biological impacts of narrative in slavery. And so trauma isn't just mental health or PTSD. It affects our limbic system. It affects our nervous system. It also affects a really important part of our body called the vagus nerve that helps regulate our nervous system, our heartbeat, the way we breathe, again, what Heather had mentioned, and really on a cellular level, and also a hormonal level with the cortisol that often in people with PTSD is risen. And so that's a stress hormone, and it causes ongoing inflammation in our body. And then our narrative can then cause disease if we don't mitigate these biological systems in our body. Also, our detox pathways can be shut down because our bodies are so in survival mode that we are trying to keep ourselves safe from these very stimuli, that our body's working really hard to like scan the environment for perceived danger, that it doesn't prioritize things like detoxing your body. And the modern world we live in today has so many toxins that if we're not detoxing them, that can also cause biological impacts and disease later in life. And another thing I learned this year is really the brain too. If you think about, you know, there's kind of what we call like the mind and mental health, and really like the physical brain. The brain can be impacted by trauma as well. And a lot of people with PTSD actually lack oxygenation in their brain. So it's not just a mental health issue, it's a body issue, and the mind and body are very, very connected. And it's interesting too, I think as survivors, you know, we often dissociate from our bodies to survive the trauma, and part of healing is what we learn to dissociate from our bodies to survive our narrative, but healing means we need to associate again with our bodies to heal. So it's the opposite of dissociation, not just mentally, but physically, having an awareness in a relationship with our body. You know, one thing that was mentioned too is like an in-access to clinical care. I could campaign about this all day. Really, during my journey, it was, you know, a 10-year journey around the United States, trying to look for a mental health clinician that was trained appropriately in complex PTSD, and secondarily, a clinician that knew how to take those medical modalities and apply it to my narrative of child trafficking. And I looked high and low around this country, and really what I found was that we don't have enough clinicians in the United States to treat this specific narrative. And to me, that was shocking to me. And as I did more work internationally, I learned, wow, like we really have a deficit of clinicians. So that's certainly a barrier. And then economically, it is so hard to access care for survivors all over the world, because if they're disabled and they're not working, they don't have the economic equity to even obtain health insurance or money to even see the clinicians that unfortunately a lot of times don't exist. And so it can feel really hopeless, but you know, I wanted to talk about free tools today because I was asked to talk about empowerment and like what can we do to empower our mental health and our bodies when we don't have the clinicians and we don't have the money. And I just want to talk about some things that are free to apply to mental health, because I believe in hope. So bear with me. Yes, so I think the first thing would be grounding, right? When I'm talking about the limbic system and the nervous system and the vagus nerve, there's things you can do to ground your body, right? And so when we're talking about the nervous system, there's 3 different stages that the nervous system actually does. And I think Heather had talked about fight or flight, when you're really nervous and scared and you're kind of hypervigilant around, for example, this marker, right? There's also a different state, I think Malika might have talked about this, where you're shut down, you're in bed, you don't want to do anything, you're just sleeping like a bear that's hibernating, right? And so they're both not really functional states. These are states in the nervous system. So one is fight and flight, and then the other is dorsal state, when you're just in bed like a hibernating bear. And so really survivors shift from dorsal to fight or flight, dorsal to flight and fight. And very rarely are they in something called the parasitic nervous system, where you're calm, you're able to focus, you're able to pursue life, you have a sense of safety, and you can pursue your purpose. And so when survivors are in dorsal states or fight or flight states, they're not able to function at the level they should at parasympathetic. But there is neat tools you can do. For example, if you grab a big bucket of ice and you submerge your face in it, for about 5 to 10 seconds, it can actually help reset the vagus nerve in your body and reset your parasympathetic nervous system. Or things like breathing and breath work can actually change your biology. Our dear friend Laurent Ziegler, an artist and activist, taught me about this and is really versed in this. But when we breathe and do breathing, we can actually change our biology on a hormonal level. For example, if you're really nervous and you put your legs up, I know this is going to sound silly. If you're very nervous and you put your legs up a wall and you put your back on the floor and you put your hands on the stomach with your legs up and you breathe in and out deeply for a few minutes, it actually can lower the cortisol in your body, lower the inflammation in your body, and it can bring you out of that very fight or flight or dorsal state. So icing your face, breathing with your legs up the wall, breath work. Another thing too is actually texture when we ground ourselves. When I was trafficked as a little girl, you can often hear of dissociation, like I was floating above myself when survivors recall, or I saw myself from a distance. And so that's dissociation. And so really associating with our bodies, right? Like the ice you can feel on your face, the legs you can feel up your wall. But another thing too is like fabrics, like touching a piece of fabric or twiddling a string. Because when we have little strings that we can twiddle, it actually grounds us and we can like feel the string and feel our bodies and be present. So skills and tools like that. Another thing I will say that I absolutely love, and I often say there's a child within me that survived, is outside of like grounding in that regard, is play, right? I think there's a lot of healing in play, whether that's dancing or joking with a friend or being a clown or being goofy. I often say the child within me definitely survived, and I love play. But what's really exciting about that lately is I've actually learned there's studies and research on your nervous system can regulate better after you play, or if you're in community playing with another person, it actually regulates your nervous system. So I thought that was really wonderful. And then another thing I would say is a free tool is making art, right? And art can come in many forms. I'm traditionally a painter. I also draw. It could be the art of speaking or the art of taking action or making a sculpture or creating a project, right? And so art really helps because, for example, if somebody's in Africa or somewhere else in the world and they don't have a clinician, by making art and painting or drawing, when you have something on a piece of paper, you can actually be a witness to your own story and also remove yourself from the story and put your narrative on a paper. The other thing too is you can take white paint and paint over it and say, well, I didn't really like that story. Like, what's a new story that I want to make for myself? So that can be really beautiful and empowering. And speaking of expression, what was I going to say? Sorry, and thank you for bearing with me. Speaking of art, is what we don't express, we actually repress. So what we don't express, we repress. And actually, when you repress your narrative and you repress your authenticity, especially anger, when you repress anger, it actually can make your T cells in your body higher, and it actually can cause things like autoimmunity and cancer later in life. So really using art to express everything that needs to be expressed actually aids in healing and prevents autoimmune and cancer later in life for survivors. And then the other thing that's free, and it was talked about, that I think is so important, it's interesting. I think especially in the Western culture I'm in right now, is we often talk a lot about pharmacology and pills and medication, right? Like this person went through an experience, they just need a pill, and it really is dehumanizing, right? And so I often say it's not a pill that these people need, it's a person. So it's not a pill, it's a person. And so the other tool I would say is community, right? And I also say it's so important to be witnessed in your authenticity. And I often say we can't exist if we don't belong. And if we don't belong, we can't exist. And I think as far as suicide prevention in this population, we need to be able to exist, but we need to be able to exist within community that has that very brave turning towards that I talked about before. And, it's interesting, sometimes survivors can feel really alone on their path, or maybe I'm the only one that was ever trafficked, or maybe I'm the only one that ever went through this, right? or you might feel like you're walking alone on the path, but I promise, you will find your community. You just have to seek it, and you will absolutely find it. But yes, so community. So I would say, grounding, body work, the ability to play, making art, having community. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is dreaming. I think that is so important, no matter where you are, how destitute your situation is. I think that helped me survive in moments of trafficking and continues to. And I'll cry because I think it's such a great tool. Is really the importance of dreaming, because we can imagine a different reality outside of our current circumstances. And I think that's just incredible and so necessary. I will share a little bit of a story about when I was trafficked, not in great detail. But when I was a little girl, I was trapped inside of a room I couldn't get out of. And I remember feeling I was not going to get out of that room alive, or that I was going to be there indefinitely. And then there was a moment where I actually had heard something. And it was actually rain on the outside of the building that I was in. And in that moment, when I heard the rain, it really gave me hope. Because in that moment, as a little girl, I thought, I might be in this room, but there's rain on the other side of that wall. And I think that gave me hope that there was another world outside of the captivity that I was in. And I think that helped me dream, actually. So every time I hear or see rain, it's just a sign of hope for me. And of course, when it snows, I say, well, that's frozen hope. So, yeah, and I think resiliency is another thing too. And, I think resiliency, and this is something I still have to practice myself, is resiliency is when you pursue what has meaning to you without worrying about the outcome. And this is something that I was taught by my friend Alex Veasley, Viktor Frankl's grandson, the man that wrote A Man's Search for Meaning. He told me this, and I try to put it in practice, but I think it's really important, that sentence. Resiliency is when you pursue something that has meaning to you without worrying about the outcome. So it's not just about having a dream, it's about pursuing a dream, and how important that is. And then resiliency also means having grit and the ability to keep going, even if things aren't ideal or perfect, or maybe you don't have the resources yet, or the housing, or the food, or the clinical care, or the community. It's about the belief that you will obtain those things, and you will obtain freedom despite the challenges. And I was actually thinking this morning, speaking in an African event, and there's always a few days in my life I won't forget, but one of the hard days and very beautiful days. But I wanted to talk about a beautiful day I had when I was in Africa. I actually had the opportunity to go to South Africa with a friend many years ago, and I was still very much in my recovery. And I actually hiked up Table Mountain in South Africa. And when I got to the top, I was just, I laugh a lot and I cry a lot, but boy, did I cry. It was beautiful. And I remember thinking, wow, I can't believe I'm alive. I can't believe I made it up this mountain. It is absolutely gorgeous. And when I talk about gifts of adversity, I think there are gifts in adversity, because I think when you go through so much trauma and so much darkness and so much destitution in situations, when you see beauty in the world, it's magnified. So I think seeing that view that day was just so beautiful to me. But I think for trauma survivors, they have a unique and innate ability to really appreciate beautiful moments in life in a different capacity. So that was really beautiful to me. But the reason I wanted to bring up that memory, not just in context to Africa today, but that the fact that life will always give us mountains to climb. You're not done after one mountain. And when I'm thinking about resiliency, I thought about that mountain, because it was not the only mountain I climbed. I'm still climbing. There will always be more mountains for me and for you. And resiliency is about the belief that we can always make it to the top. It's about also helping other people get to the top as we climb as a community. Malika, you're an incredible leader. You're so good at this. And it's about the play that we do when we get to the peak. So those are things I thought about today before I joined. So really all of these tools, the ability to heal, the ability to dream, the ability to express yourself and connect, this is what makes us inherently human. And when you go through something like human trafficking or slavery, it's dehumanizing crimes to go through. But all of these things I talked about really allow us to have agency and live in our own humanity. So I think that's really, really important. I'll talk about the word trauma to start to close here, but really the word trauma comes from an old Greek word that means wound. And if trauma is a wound caused by narrative, the thing that's actually really cool is if you think about it, if trauma is a wound that can be caused by narrative, we can actually heal that same wound by an alternative narrative we create for ourselves. And by living a different narrative, we can actually not just heal the mental wound, but we can heal biological wounding in our bodies by choosing to live in a different narrative. And I think that's really beautiful. I'm going to end with this, though, that I do hope one day all survivors can say these words. I connected in my authenticity. I loved in community. I expressed with my art. I breathed with ease. I pursued my dreams, and I healed fully in freedom. So that's my hope for all survivors. And thank you so very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Kendall. That's so profound. Thank you for sharing all of that with us. First, I would like to apologize to all of us who've joined today. We are way behind time. We are 30 minutes behind time. We are so sorry. And thank you so much, Kendall. So much love to you. Thank you for sharing all of this. I'm not going to reiterate because I in fact, have been writing, but because of time, we don't want to eat more into everyone's time. But indeed, I think I'm going with a big box of knowledge from this session. Thank you so much. So finally, we are going to have Lucia close the session for us. Lucia, are you ready? Please take the floor. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to start by watching a 2-minute clip, but I cannot carry on going forward without saying thank you so much, Kendall, for your beautiful words. And we have 17 viewers now, but I think every single person listening has taken something from today, whether it be a tip, inspiration, or coming together and using our voices. So thank you all. And we're almost there, guys. We're almost wrapping up. So let's start with this video. Share. Okay. So here's this is going to be about spiritual healers. And this is an example of a South African spiritual healer ceremony.
How did I end up here? Drenched and perched precariously atop a South African mountain. Well, I'm undergoing a cleansing ceremony with a traditional healer. Traditional healers believe they receive supernatural guidance from ancestral spirits and have been part of Africa's social fabric for centuries. These shamans use traditional medicines and rituals to help improve people's mental health. Healers are vital in Africa, where there's a severe shortage of therapists across the continent. And they're increasingly popular among younger people. But why?
You can go down any street, any corner, and somebody will be able to point you in the direction of a traditional healer.
Well, they're still popular because the people in the community still believe that their methods and their medicines work.
I think that when people go through things that they cannot explain, like depression or anxiety, they go to the people that they've heard about from their fathers or their grandfathers. They go to traditional healers.
Traditional healers have helped my family and extended family during our time of grieving with cleansing, so that we can be hopeful that everything will be okay after our.
So that's just a small clip of one of the things we spoke about today, which was healing in a group using African methods, and mixing not, how would you say, Western frameworks and conventions with spiritual healing. So we've spoken about this. There is no right way to heal. There are, sorry, I need my notes here. So there's no one way to heal. Healing is communal. Healing is a self journey, and it is guided by elders, spiritual leaders, or by therapists, clinicians. It can be ancestral connection, herbal medicine, spiritual balance, but it can also be focus on brain connection, symptom relief. It could be rituals, storytelling, dreaming, art, or group therapy, CMDR or EMDR, CBT, talk therapy. There is no one path. Instead, it is learning what is right for you. So what we can do when we're helping others learn is give people space to discover what works for them. So I think one of the most powerful things I view healing is as reclamation. Healing is not about erasing the past. It is about reclaiming voice, dignity, safety, and future. It must feel like home and not be imposed. It is your own journey. It is personal. It's not I hear this all the time, but it is a journey. It's not a destination. But how can we make this possible? From today, we've learned a lot of different ways that healing is possible, a lot of different techniques, a lot of different mechanisms that go on in our brain and body, biological, social, community. But we can now, sitting here today or listening today, use local languages and familiar formats as a way to demystify, destigmatize healing and make it approachable and applicable for everyone. Train traditional healers in trauma basics and referrals. By doing that, we can bridge the gap between Western methods and traditional methods to make it more, I would say, to make it approachable for people and reduce stigma. So another way is reducing stigma through trusted community leaders, having these conversations, and creating hybrid spaces like community hubs, virtual teaching courses, spiritual centers, and modern tools to bridge the gap and educate people. And finally, support survivors in defining healing for themselves, and by creating these judgment-free zones and making healing a reclamation. So I'm going to finish this off with a quote. Healing is not given to us. It is created by us in our voices, our culture, our community, and our courage to rise. And I think this perfectly sums up everything we've learned today. And I'm so grateful to be here with you all. And I hope you've learned just as much as I have today.
Thank you so much, Lucia. Finally, just give me less than 5 minutes of your time. We are going to do a post test. We did a pre-test before we started, just something to quickly round up with.